This may look like a simple Victorian portrait, a child seated in an ornate chair, eyes closed as though peacefully asleep, but look closer, this is no ordinary photograph. The boy you see here never opened his eyes again. His mother, Helena Morrison, refused to let death have the final word. What followed was an experiment that blurred the line between love and madness, science and the occult, and the image she left behind still unsettles anyone who dares to stare too long. The Victorian era was a paradox of progress and tragedy. Industry thrived, empires expanded, science advanced. But behind the grandeur lay a cruel reality. Death was everywhere, and it came without warning. For families across Europe and America, child mortality was not an exception, it was the rule. In the mid-1800s, 1 in every 3 children did not survive past the age of 5. Epidemics swept entire neighborhoods, and even the wealthiest households found themselves powerless against diseases like diphtheria, cholera, and scarlet fever. It was in this world that post-mortem photography emerged, not as a morbid curiosity, but as a cultural necessity. To modern eyes, the images seem eerie, unsettling, even grotesque, but to grieving parents of the 19th century, they were sacred relics, the final and often only chance to hold on to the face of a loved one. The practice was simple in theory, yet deeply complex in execution. Photographers became quiet undertakers of memory. They specialized in arranging the dead as though they were still alive, sitting them upright, resting them peacefully on sofas, or even propping them against hidden frames. In many portraits, eyes were painted onto closed eyelids to mimic wakefulness. In others, surviving family members gathered around the body, their expressions a haunting mixture of pride, love, and devastation. These photographs carried a strange duality. They immortalized life in the very moment of death, and for countless families who could never afford a photograph during life, this final portrait became their only connection to the one they had lost. But among the thousands of such images, one would stand apart. The case of Helena Morrison and her son James would push this practice far beyond memorialization. It would enter a darker, stranger realm where love, science, and obsession collided. Helena Morrison was no ordinary widow. By the standards of 19th century Boston society, she was an anomaly, born into a family of merchants, educated in Paris at a time when few women were allowed near medical texts. She had studied anatomy and physiology with a determination that unsettled her peers. Some whispered that she was unnatural, that her interests belonged more to laboratories than to parlors. When her husband died, Helena was left with both wealth and freedom, 2 things most Victorian women never tasted. She poured her energy into raising her only son, James, shielding him with relentless devotion. Neighbors saw a mother who never let the child out of her sight, a woman who read medical journals late into the night, and who corrected doctors when they prescribed what she considered outdated treatments. But her brilliance came with isolation. Boston's high society viewed her with suspicion. She was respected but not embraced, a woman dabbling in medicine, a widow refusing to remarry, a mother fiercely protective to the point of obsession. Helena was tolerated but never trusted, and when tragedy struck her household in 1887, her isolation deepened into something far more dangerous. For Helena, James was not only her son, he was her last tether to purpose, her last proof that life could be more than loss. To lose him would not simply mean grief, it would mean annihilation. This is what set Helena apart. Thousands of mothers buried their children in that cruel winter. Only Helena would take her grief and transform it into an experiment that defied death itself. The winter of 1887 was one of Boston's darkest seasons. The city was cloaked in snow, its streets echoing with the sound of bells tolling for funerals. Diphtheria, a disease once called the strangling angel of children, ravaged neighborhoods with ruthless efficiency. The illness began innocently enough, with a sore throat, a cough, a fever, but within days it revealed its true horror. A thick, gray membrane formed in the throat, suffocating the victim slowly. Doctors tried everything: mercury, gargles, bleeding, even tracheotomies, but the disease was merciless. Entire households lost multiple children in a single week. In Boston alone, hundreds of small coffins were carried to graveyards that winter, and still no cure existed. Newspapers carried grim statistics daily, while ministers urged parents to prepare for the worst. For Helena Morrison, the outbreak was not a distant tragedy. It was at her door, inside her home, gripping the throat of her only child. She fought with every resource at her disposal: European medicines, private consultations, and her own hard-earned medical knowledge. But diphtheria respected neither wealth nor education. On a bitter January morning in 1888, as snow pressed heavily against the windows of her mansion, James Morrison took his final breath. The doctors marked the time of death, but for Helena, time itself seemed to stop. The room was silent except for the crackle of the fireplace. Outside, snow blanketed the streets of Boston. Inside, Helena Morrison sat by her son's bed, clutching his small, cold hand. James's struggle had been long and cruel. His breathing, once shallow gasps, had slowed until finally there was nothing. The doctor at his side announced the time of death, 9:15 in the morning. The servants wept softly, crossing themselves. The parish priest, summoned for last rites, prepared to pray, but Helena heard nothing. Her world had collapsed into a hollow silence. She stared at her boy's face, pale yet still bearing traces of innocence. This was not a corpse. This was her child. How could a doctor reduce his existence to a line in a ledger? How could the church speak of heaven when all she saw was absence? Grief often bends time, but Helena's reaction bent reality itself. She ordered everyone from the room, doctors, servants, even the priest, dismissed. The heavy oak door closed, and she turned the key. Alone, she sat with James's body. Hours passed, then a day. No one knew what transpired inside that locked room, but when Helena finally emerged, her face no longer bore the raw agony of mourning. In its place was something colder. A decision had been made. What happened during those 24 hours behind the locked door has remained one of the most disturbing mysteries of Victorian Boston. Witnesses outside reported muffled movements, the clink of glass, even the hiss of chemicals, but none dared intervene. Inside, Helena Morrison had begun her work. With the calm of a surgeon and the desperation of a mother, she prepared her son's body, not for burial, but for preservation. She cleaned, measured, recorded. Bottles of imported chemicals lined the desk. Tools of anatomy gleamed under candlelight. For Helena, grief was not paralysis, it was fuel. Every hour, she applied what she had learned in Paris. Preservation techniques whispered about in shadowed lecture halls, methods straddling the line between science and the forbidden. By the time she unlocked the door the next day, James Morrison no longer resembled a boy lost to disease. He resembled a boy at rest, suspended between life and death. Neighbors whispered that she had simply accepted her loss, but those who saw her eyes knew differently. Helena was no longer a grieving mother. She was a woman with a plan, one that would lead to one of the most chilling photographs in Victorian history. Long before Helena Morrison became a widow, long before Boston whispered about her eccentric ways, there had been Paris, the city of light, but also the city of shadows. In the 1870s, Helena had lived there briefly with her husband, a wealthy importer who dealt in textiles. While he conducted business, Helena wandered the narrow streets of the Latin Quarter, slipping into lecture halls where young men studied medicine and anatomy. Women were not allowed in these spaces, but Helena was persistent. Through family connections, and perhaps through sheer determination, she gained access to select lectures and laboratories. There, she learned about preservation. She listened to surgeons discuss how bodies could be kept for dissection far beyond their natural decay. She saw demonstrations of chemical injections that slowed corruption, wax, light coatings applied to skin, and even whispered theories about vital stimulation, efforts to spark faint muscular reactions in the newly dead. It was knowledge that fascinated her. While other women attended salons and concerts, Helena filled notebooks with sketches of arteries, notes on chemical solutions, and the names of French doctors whose reputations were already scandalous. When she returned to Boston, she carried with her more than memories. She carried methods, bottles of strange substances, formulas in French handwriting, and an education that society insisted no woman should have. Years later, when James's small body lay lifeless on that winter morning, it was Paris that guided Helena's hands. When Helena emerged from her locked room, James did not look like a boy who had been gone for 24 hours. His lips were not blue, his skin had not yet sunk into the waxy pallor of death. Instead, there was a softness to his features, a calmness that unsettled those who saw him. The truth, though never fully proven, lay in Helena's use of forbidden methods. Witnesses would later describe strange scents drifting from her chamber, sharp chemical odors that did not belong in a household. She had ordered shipments from France, phenol, arsenical compounds, tinctures that physicians of the time condemned as dangerous. Rather than preparing James for burial, Helena had prepared him for preservation. The blood was treated, the tissue stiffened, the skin carefully treated with a pale solution that gave it a faint glow. Her actions were not embalming as understood today. They were experiments, crude but effective, half medical and half occult. Neighbors whispered that James's body appeared too alive. One maid claimed she saw his fingers twitch, though it may have been nothing more than rigor mortis releasing. Still, the impression remained. Helena was not simply mourning. She was preserving, prolonging, perhaps even attempting to restore. To outsiders, the boy's stillness was peaceful. To Helena, it was proof that her knowledge could keep him close, that death did not need to mean separation. And so, instead of a coffin, she planned something else. A photograph, but not just any photograph. A final portrait so convincing it would deceive even the eye of a trained observer. In the heart of Boston, there was one name whispered whenever families wanted post-mortem photography done with care: Augustus Petton. Petton was no ordinary photographer. He specialized in memorial portraits, and his reputation for sensitivity and artistry was unmatched. He knew how to arrange the dead so they appeared merely asleep, how to soften light so that pallor became serenity. Many of his clients swore his photographs made the deceased look more alive than they had in life. When Helena sent for him, Petton hesitated. Her reputation as a brilliant but peculiar widow preceded her, yet business was business, and grief was something he understood well. He had buried 2 children of his own. Petton arrived at the Morrison mansion on a cold, gray morning. He expected weeping, perhaps hysteria, perhaps the quiet resignation he had seen countless times before. What he found instead was Helena calm, composed, and disturbingly precise. She guided him to James's room. The boy sat upright in a chair, hands folded, hair combed neatly. To Petton's shock, the child's appearance was unlike anything he had ever encountered. No swelling, no slackness, no visible decay. For a moment, he thought the boy might actually be alive. Helena's instructions were firm. The photograph was to show her son not as dead, but as if resting, ready to rise. Every detail mattered: the angle of his head, the positioning of his hands, the softness of the light through the drapes. For Petton, this was not merely another commission. It was something different, something that felt wrong. Photographers were used to working in drawing rooms or parlors, but Petton noticed immediately that James's chamber was no ordinary child's bedroom. On the desk beside the bed lay vials and jars labeled in French. A metal stand held instruments that looked more suited to a surgical theater than a home. The air carried a faint medicinal tang mixed with the waxy sweetness of preserved flowers placed at the windowsill. Petton, though a professional, felt a prickle at the back of his neck. This was no ordinary grieving household. This was something between a home and a laboratory. Helena spoke little, but her eyes missed nothing. She adjusted James's collar herself, repositioned his hand when it slipped slightly from her intended pose. When Petton tried to offer suggestions, she silenced him with a look. This was not his composition. This was hers. Later, Petton would confess that the strangest thing was James's posture. Dead bodies rarely held positions naturally. They sagged, they resisted, but James sat upright, as if guided by some unseen firmness within. It was unnatural, unsettling, and beyond explanation. The photographer, though experienced, could not shake the feeling that he was part of something he should not witness. Yet Helena insisted the work continue, and so, reluctantly, he raised his camera. The moment was staged with precision. James Morrison, dead for days, sat in his small wooden chair. Dressed in his finest Sunday clothes, his head tilted slightly to the left, as though he were gazing at something just beyond the window, his hands, folded neatly in his lap, gave the impression of prayerful rest. Petton arranged his equipment, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the lens. He had photographed the dead many times before, but this child looked too real, too still, yes, but not gone. The exposure was long as cameras of the day required. During those minutes, Petton swore he saw something move, a flicker in James's fingers, a shift in his lips, perhaps nothing more than the tricks of light and shadow, yet the effect was chilling. The boy seemed on the verge of breathing again. When the plate was finally exposed, Helena inspected it with obsessive detail. She was not grieving, she was not broken, she was satisfied. Yes, she whispered, he is perfect. Petton, however, felt only dread, for in that image, an image meant to comfort, there was something uncanny, something that made even the living feel the weight of death pressing close. The camera's lens had frozen James Morrison in time, but Augustus Petton swore that what happened during the exposure could not be explained away by tricks of the eye. He had seen it clearly, or at least he thought he had. As the long minutes of stillness dragged on, James's lips seemed to quiver. His small fingers, folded neatly in his lap, twitched as though responding to some silent command. It was the faintest movement, gone as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to make Petton's blood run cold. Photographers were familiar with the way rigor mortis shifted bodies, the subtle loosening of muscles as they decayed, but this was different. James's motion felt deliberate, not mechanical, as if somewhere inside that preserved shell something had stirred. Petton wanted to stop, to pack his equipment and leave, but Helena's eyes held him fast. She saw nothing unnatural in the boy's pose, or if she did, she welcomed it. For her, these movements, real or imagined, were signs that James had not been entirely taken from her. Later, Petton would write in his private journal, "The boy was not entirely gone. I know what I saw, but to speak it aloud would be madness." When the first images developed, Petton studied them with a mounting unease. The exposure was clear, the detail sharp. James sat as though in a quiet moment of reflection, his face illuminated by soft daylight filtering through the drapes. But there was something else, something the camera had caught that Petton swore was not present in the room. Behind the boy's chair, a faint shadow stretched along the wall, longer than it should have been. It was as though another figure, indistinct yet unmistakably human in shape, hovered just out of sight. The angle of the light made no sense. The room had been carefully arranged, the curtains drawn to allow only one source of illumination, and yet in the photograph there appeared to be two. Helena, when shown the image, studied it with calm satisfaction. "He is not alone," she murmured. To her, the shadow was no mistake. It was proof that James's presence lingered, tethered to her work. Petton, however, felt something far darker. He had seen tricks of exposure before, accidents of chemistry and glass. But this shadow, this form, did not feel accidental. It felt deliberate, as if the camera had revealed something the human eye was not meant to see. Helena Morrison was not content with one photograph. The process became ritual. She adjusted angles, changed backdrops, and demanded exposure after exposure, chasing not just an image, but perfection. She guided James's body with the precision of a sculptor. If his head tilted too far, she corrected it. If his hands slipped from her chosen pose, she reset them with steady determination. For Helena, this was no mere picture, it was resurrection. Petton grew increasingly unsettled. He had worked with grieving mothers before, but Helena's composure was unnatural. Where others sobbed, she calculated. Where others trembled, she directed. Hours turned to days. The house grew quiet, its servants dismissed, its windows shuttered. Helena ate little, slept less, consumed by her project. She hovered over Petton's chemicals, noting every measurement, every adjustment, as though the process itself were an experiment in which she was both partner and master. Her obsession was not grief, it was control. She would not let death dictate the final image of her son. She would shape it herself, bending reality to her will, until James appeared not dead, not dying, but preserved in eternal stillness. Among Helena's belongings was a leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with her precise, slanted handwriting. To outsiders, it appeared as nothing more than a mother's journal, but those who studied it later would describe it as something far more chilling, a record of experiments. She detailed chemical compounds, quantities, and timings. She noted the effects on skin tone, the stiffness of limbs, even the faint appearance of moisture in the eyes. On one page, she wrote, "Solution holds. Skin remains supple. James looks as though merely asleep. Progress undeniable." But beyond the scientific entries were passages that revealed the true depths of her obsession. "The veil is thin," she scrawled. "He lingers if I maintain him." On another, "Petton doubts, he sees but denies. I will show him what lies between breath and silence." The notebook was both logbook and confession, a window into a mind that no longer accepted the boundaries of death. For Helena, this was not madness, this was devotion. After days of posing, adjusting, and capturing, the final photograph was complete. Augustus Petton developed the plate with trembling hands, his heart heavy with dread. The result was undeniable. James Morrison, dressed in white, seated gracefully in his chair, eyes half closed as though resting after play. There was no trace of death in the image, no sunken features, no lifeless slackness. He looked alive. To Helena, it was triumph. She cradled the photograph with reverence, whispering to it as though it were James himself, "See, you are still with me." To Petton, it was horror. The boy's stillness, the softness of his skin, the faint impression of warmth captured on glass. It was too perfect, too unnatural. The photograph, meant as comfort, became something else. A thing that unsettled, that disturbed, that carried with it an aura no living child could possess. When Helena smiled at the finished plate, Petton felt only the urge to flee, for he knew that he had not merely captured an image of a child. He had helped create something that blurred the line between remembrance and resurrection. Augustus Petton left the Morrison mansion with the photographs neatly packed, but no amount of distance could calm the storm in his mind. He had done what he was paid for, yet the work haunted him in a way no commission ever had. Other post-mortem sessions, though solemn, had always carried with them a kind of quiet dignity, a final act of memory for grieving families. But this felt like something entirely different. Every time Petton shut his eyes, he saw James's face, not the lifeless features he had expected, but the uncanny softness that Helena's methods had achieved. Worse still, he could not shake the impression that the boy had responded, however faintly, to his touch. A twitch here, a shift there too subtle for rigor mortis, too unnatural for coincidence. In his journal, he wrote, "The boy sits not as the dead do, but as one who rests. If I did not know the truth, I could swear there is still breathe within him. The unease gnawed at him." He considered destroying the negatives altogether, yet curiosity, that cruel companion of the human soul, kept him from doing so. Something in those images begged to be studied further, though every instinct told him not to. When Petton developed the first large print of James Morrison, he placed it in the drying rack with the others. But as he worked, he felt a strange sensation, that he was being observed. He glanced back, and there it was, James's portrait, catching the lamplight in such a way that his half-lidded eyes seemed to follow Petton across the room. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of exposure. Many photographs, depending on how the light struck them, created the illusion of movement. Yet the longer he stared, the harder it became to shake the feeling. James's expression was not fixed. It seemed to shift with every angle. Sometimes calm, sometimes curious, and in one brief, horrifying instant, almost knowing. Petton turned the photograph face down, but that brought no comfort, for in his mind the image remained imprinted deeper than any other he had ever created. He would later describe it in a letter to a fellow photographer. "It is as though the boy is not merely pictured, but present. The plate does not hold an image, it holds him." 3 days later, as Petton wrestled with his unease, a knock came at his studio door. Standing before him was Dr. Harrison Wickham, the county coroner, his expression grave. Without pleasantries, Wickham asked about Helena Morrison, about James, about the photographs. His questions carried weight, as though he already knew pieces of the truth and was waiting for Petton to confirm them. At first, Petton hesitated, fearing professional disgrace, but Wickham's persistence wore him down. Slowly, he admitted that Helena's preservation techniques were unlike anything he had ever seen. He spoke of the strange laboratory equipment, the chemical smells, the unnatural condition of James's body. Wickham listened in silence, his face tightening with each detail. When Petton finished, the coroner leaned forward and spoke in a low, deliberate voice. "Mr. Petton, you must understand. What Mrs. Morrison attempted is not medicine. It borders on desecration. I have reason to believe she imported substances from France, substances outlawed even by their physicians. If your account is true, then James Morrison was not merely embalmed. He was experimented upon." Petton felt the room tilt. His suspicions, once vague, were now solid. He had not only participated in something unnatural, he might also have witnessed the edge of something forbidden. In the days that followed, Dr. Wickham shared fragments of his investigation with Petton. Helena, he explained, had been corresponding with French physicians rumored to practice reanimation studies. These men believed that death was not an absolute, but a condition that could be stalled, even reversed, through chemical means. They spoke of muscles retaining memory, of nerves rekindled by certain compounds, of consciousness lingering at the border between life and oblivion. Helena, armed with her medical training, had taken these ideas further. The preservation of James was not simply an act of love. It was an experiment in holding him at the threshold. Petton recoiled. If true, then the slight movements he had seen, the twitching fingers, the almost breathing lips, were not the tricks of a photographer's tired eyes. They were results. It chilled him to the core. James had not been posed like other corpses. He had been maintained, preserved, perhaps even suspended between two worlds. Before Wickham could act decisively, news came that stunned both men. Helena Morrison had disappeared. Her mansion, once filled with whispers of grief and obsession, now stood shuttered and empty. The servants, dismissed weeks before, claimed they had received no word of her return. Her lawyers revealed only that she had left instructions to sell the property quickly and discreetly. Of Helena herself, no trace. Some whispered she had gone back to France, chasing the secrets of the physicians she once studied with. Others claimed she had fled Boston under threat of scandal. Among the city's gossiping elite, darker rumors spread that Helena had not left alone, that she had taken with her something precious, something that was neither fully alive nor fully dead. Petton, hearing this, felt a chill that no fire could dispel. If Helena had indeed carried James with her, then the photograph he still kept in his studio was no mere memorial. It was the only remaining witness to an experiment that had crossed the boundaries of human understanding. And every time Petton dared to look at it, he swore James Morrison's eyes were closer to opening. After Helena's disappearance, the Morrison mansion became a place of whispers. Neighbors, once intrigued by the family's wealth, now crossed the street to avoid the looming estate. Its tall windows, once filled with candlelight, stared out as hollow eyes. The house had not been abandoned entirely. Lawyers and agents arrived occasionally to catalog Helena's belongings, but they did so quickly, never lingering after dusk. They complained of drafts that seemed to carry voices, of strange stains on the floorboards, of a suffocating stillness that clung to every room. One clerk swore he had found a child's handprint pressed into a mirror upstairs, though the glass was covered in dust and no children had entered the home in months. Another refused to return after claiming he heard the faint sound of breathing in the parlor, as though someone sat in the grand chair, unseen. The locals called it the House of Silence, but silence as they meant it was not peace. It was the silence of breath held too long, of something waiting to stir. Though he tried to resume his work, Augustus Petton found himself drawn again and again to the Morrison negatives. He told himself it was professional curiosity. The images were, after all, the finest technical work of his career. Yet in truth, they frightened him more than they fascinated. In the dark room, when the lantern burned low, James's face emerged again from the chemical baths. Each time, Petton swore there was some slight alteration. A change in the angle of the boy's head, a faint shift in expression, as though the image itself refused to remain static. He stored copies in a locked cabinet, but their presence weighed heavily on him. Visitors to his studio who glimpsed the photographs often paused, unsettled. Some commented that the boy looked alive, others that they felt strangely watched. One elderly woman burst into tears, insisting she recognized the child. When Petton explained the boy had recently died, she grew pale and whispered, "No. I saw him in the marketplace just last week." Petton dismissed her words as confusion, but late at night, alone in his studio, he wondered if she had truly been mistaken. Dr. Harrison Wickham's investigation into Helena Morrison slowed to a crawl. Without her presence, without the body of James, the law offered little ground for action. Officially, James had died, and his death certificate bore Wickham's own signature. There was no crime the courts would recognize, yet Wickham could not let the matter rest. He pieced together fragments from Helena's notebooks recovered from the mansion, formulas scribbled between lines of personal grief, diagrams of the human body annotated with chilling precision. He saw references to French physicians who believed the spark of life could be coaxed back into dormant nerves. The more he read, the more convinced he became that Helena's experiments had not ended with preservation. She had sought something far greater, something Wickham feared to name aloud. But in Boston's conservative medical circles, his warnings fell on deaf ears. Colleagues dismissed him as a man too entangled in rumors, a grieving mother's eccentricities. They said nothing more. Wickham, however, could not shake the feeling that the case was unfinished. "She has taken her secrets with her," he wrote in his own notes, "but I cannot believe she has taken them to the grave." In the spring of 1889, a strange rumor began to circulate among collectors of rare photographs in New England. A single image, circulating quietly in private hands, was said to be unlike any other. It depicted a boy in a fine chair, dressed elegantly, eyes half closed as if in gentle slumber. To the untrained eye, it was simply a well-composed portrait, but those who owned it for even a short time swore the image carried a weight. A merchant in Salem claimed the boy's expression altered depending on who looked at it. A lawyer in Hartford said his daughter became obsessed with the photograph, speaking of the child as if he visited her in dreams. When the man attempted to burn the image, the flames sputtered and died, leaving the print unharmed. No one could trace the photograph's true origin, though whispers linked it to the vanished Helena Morrison. Collectors called it simply the boy, and wherever it went, unease followed. Among the belongings left behind in the Morrison mansion, one page of Helena's notebook stood apart from the rest. It was written hastily, the ink smudged as though her hand had trembled. It read, "He lingers still. The barrier weakens. Tonight I heard him whisper my name. Soon the photograph will no longer be enough. Soon I must take him with me." No signature, no date, only that chilling line. For years afterward, historians, collectors, and occult enthusiasts debated its meaning. Was it the ravings of a grieving woman collapsing into madness, or was it, as some whispered, a record of success? Proof that Helena had managed what others only dreamed of? Petton himself never spoke publicly of the notebook, but in his private journal, decades later, he confessed, "If she took the boy with her, then I fear the world has not seen the last of James Morrison, for death was not enough to hold him." By the early 1890s, the Morrison estate was sold at auction, though Helena's disappearance remained unsolved. Creditors and distant relatives wasted no time stripping her wealth. The mansion, once a symbol of refined Boston privilege, was picked apart piece by piece. Furniture disappeared into the parlors of other families, paintings found their way into galleries, and crates of personal belongings were quietly carted away. Yet several items, it was said, caused unease among buyers. One rocking chair was returned within a week when the new owner swore it moved on its own in the night. A mirror from the second floor hallway cracked into a perfect spiderweb pattern the first time it was polished, though no hand touched it. But the most notorious item was a chest containing preserved specimens and handwritten notes. The auctioneer halted the sale mid-lot after one man fainted at the sight of a glass jar filled with what looked like a child's hand, half floating in amber liquid. The chest was Never seen again, its whereabouts lost to time. The house itself passed to strangers, but the neighbors never truly accepted the new owners. They claimed the property belonged to Helena still, and the name Morrison clung to the estate like ivy. Among the few to benefit from the tragedy was Augustus Petton. Though Helena had vanished, Petton retained the original negatives of the Morrison session. He rarely admitted it, but duplicates were made before the authorities intervened. Why he did so, even he could not fully explain. Perhaps it was greed, the knowledge that collectors would one day pay fortunes for such a unique image, or perhaps it was fear that destroying the negatives might not destroy what they contained. For years, he kept them hidden in a locked box, only developing prints for select clients who swore secrecy. Yet every time he opened the box, he felt a strange pull, as though the boy's half-shut eyes demanded attention. Petton aged, but the photograph remained pristine. He often told friends in his final years that it was the finest portrait he had ever taken. Yet when pressed, he always added the same chilling remark, "I did not capture him. He captured me." The photograph began to circulate in whispers, not through newspapers or galleries, but by private invitation. A friend would show it to another, always with caution. The reactions were rarely casual. Some saw only grief, a mother desperate to remember her child. Others recoiled, claiming the boy looked too aware, too alive. A few insisted the eyes followed them across the room, the faintest glimmer of recognition in their depths. One prominent minister in Boston denounced the image as blasphemous, declaring it a perversion of God's will. Yet in the same breath he admitted he could not look away. Strangest of all were those who claimed to dream of James after seeing the photograph. They described the same visions, the boy standing in a dim room, calling softly, as though asking to be let in. Collectors began to treat the photograph not as art, but as an object of power, and in that private world of fascination and dread, the name, the boy, took root. No one remembers who first called the photograph the boy. It might have been a collector, a journalist, or perhaps even Petton himself, but the title spread quickly, and soon no other name was needed. The boy became shorthand for unease. When spoken in certain circles, it carried an unspoken weight, as though all present understood. It was not merely a picture of a dead child. It was something else, something that seemed to breathe in the shadows of its frame. By the late 1890s, tales of the boy reached beyond Boston. Scholars in New York and London debated its authenticity. Was it simply an exceptional piece of post-mortem photography, or was it evidence of Helena's rumored experiments with life and death? Whatever the answer, the image endured. People who saw it once never forgot it, and those who possessed it often wished they hadn't. Decades passed, but the Morrison case refused to fade. In the early 20th century, photography had advanced, yet the boy still drew attention. Scholars from Harvard examined Petton's negatives and concluded that no trickery had been used. The lighting, the posture, the exposure, all were within the realm of possibility, and yet they admitted uneasily the vitality in the child's face could not be explained by technique alone. There was something wrong. Occultists claimed Helena had infused the photograph with the essence of her son, trapping his soul in chemical salts and silver. Skeptics dismissed such claims, but could not explain why so many unrelated witnesses described the same sensations when viewing the image. By 1925, copies of the photograph were rare but still whispered about in academic and occult circles alike. Even then, nearly 40 years later, one phrase lingered, scribbled in journals and whispered among collectors: "He does not sleep. He waits." By the turn of the century, the boy became a subject of fierce debate. Some hailed it as a technical marvel, proof that post-mortem photography could transcend its grim reality. Others whispered it was something else entirely. Doctors insisted there was nothing unusual about the portrait. They argued that with the right chemicals, a body could be made to look almost lifelike for several hours. Rigor mortis softened, skin appeared supple, and shadows created illusions of warmth. But skeptics raised uncomfortable questions. Why did the photograph unsettle even trained professionals? Why did witnesses insist on seeing subtle movements, shifts in the eyes, faint twitches of the lips, that could not exist in a still image. To believers, the explanation was simple. Helena Morrison had not photographed her dead son. She had trapped something in between, not life, not death, but a liminal state. It was here, at the crossroads of medicine and myth, that the boy gained its infamous reputation. Helena Morrison's ties to French medical circles hinted at her true intentions. In Paris, researchers explored galvanism, the reanimation of dead tissue through electrical current. Others experimented with chemical preservation, not for beauty but for manipulation of the body. Helena's notebooks, fragments of which survived, revealed her obsession with these ideas. She wrote of vital spark, nerve memory, and the threshold. These were not the writings of a grieving mother merely clinging to her child's image. They were the notes of a woman probing forbidden frontiers. Her methods blended scientific technique with ritualistic elements. She recorded the hours of night when James seemed most responsive, described how certain hymns calmed him, and marked symbols in her margins that resembled alchemical sigils. It was as though Helena sought not only to preserve James but to create a bridge, a doorway where science ended and the occult began, and some feared she had succeeded. Was Helena Morrison a visionary or a woman broken by grief? Historians remain divided. On one hand, she was a mother who had lost her only child. Her actions could be seen as desperate attempts to hold on to love, to resist the cruel finality of death. In an era when many parents buried children before they reached adulthood, her grief was not unique, but her response was. On the other hand, her journals revealed a mind that crossed boundaries others dared not approach. She wrote of binding James to me and not letting the grave take what is mine. These were not expressions of comfort, they were declarations of possession. Some contemporaries described her as cold, precise, unshaken by social scandal. Others insisted she wept at night, her cries echoing through the halls of her mansion. Love and madness are not always separate. Sometimes they wear the same mask. Helena's story suggests they may even share the same heart. The Morrison case also revealed something darker about Victorian society itself. While the public condemned Helena's actions as unnatural, many were drawn to the spectacle in secret. Collectors whispered about the photograph, scholars requested to study it, and spiritualists declared it proof of their beliefs. Death was both feared and fetishized in the 19th century. Families displayed hair lockets, death masks, and mourning jewelry. Entire industries thrived on grief, turning sorrow into profit. Helena was in many ways a product of this culture. She simply pushed further than most dared. Her obsession was extreme, but it was not alien. It was rooted in the same hunger that drove seances, ghost photography, and spiritualist revivals. Helena was both an outcast and a mirror, reflecting hidden desires of a society fascinated by death, even as it pretended to fear it. Beyond Helena, the 19th century saw countless secret experiments conducted on the dead. Medical schools bought corpses for dissection. Inventors shocked cadavers with electricity to watch limbs twitch. In Europe, rumors spread of doctors trying to restart hearts long after death. What made Helena unique was her personal motive. Most worked in laboratories, publishing their findings for acclaim. Helena worked in the solitude of her home, with no audience but her son. Her experiments were not for science. They were for love, yet some argue that her isolation made her more dangerous. Without the checks of academic scrutiny, she crossed boundaries unchecked. Did she attempt electrical stimulation? Did she test unrecorded chemicals? Her missing notes leave only speculation. What is clear is this: when science and secrecy meet, the results are often monstrous. And Helena's story remains one of the most haunting examples of how the thirst for knowledge and the refusal to accept loss can turn even a mother's love into something terrifying. When whispers of the boy spread into churches, outrage soon followed. Ministers across Boston declared Helena Morrison's acts as profane. They warned congregations that meddling with the dead was no better than necromancy, an offense against both God and nature. Some sermons described Helena as a woman who had traded faith for forbidden knowledge, a soul consumed by pride. "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away," thundered Reverend Abbot of Trinity Church, but this woman dared to take back what God had claimed. Yet even as pastors condemned her, their congregants could not resist gossip. Parishioners sought out the photograph in secret. sometimes even traveling to Petton's studio under false pretenses. To the clergy, this was evidence of Satan's lure. To the curious, it was proof that death could be challenged. Thus, Helena became both a cautionary tale and a strange, morbid inspiration, a woman condemned from pulpits but whispered about in pews. For decades, post-mortem photography was considered a respectable, if melancholy, art form. Families wished to capture final likenesses of their loved ones, a tradition born of grief and remembrance. But Helena Morrison's case cast a shadow over the entire practice. Critics pointed to the boy as proof of excess, the moment when photography crossed a moral line. No longer a portrait of peace, it became an image of unease, of something unnatural. "It is not memory," one columnist wrote, "it is mockery." Photographers in New England found clients questioning their work. Some even refused post-mortem commissions, fearing association with Helena's scandal. Others leaned into the morbid fascination, advertising themselves as able to create lifelike death portraits that rivaled Morrison's. The profession never fully escaped the stain. Even today, when historians speak of Victorian mourning photography, Helena Morrison's name is never far behind. Those who viewed the Morrison photograph often reported one particular sensation. It came not immediately, but after a few seconds of staring. The boy's eyes, half shut and peaceful, seemed to shift. A glint, a shimmer, just enough to suggest he might open them at any moment. Some swore his lips twitched, forming the beginnings of a word. Others insisted they heard a faint sound, like a sigh, though no one else in the room heard it. One scholar who studied the image under magnification concluded the photograph itself had not changed, but when asked to describe the expression of the boy, he faltered. "It was not the same as when I first looked," he confessed. Haunting was not in the paper, nor in the chemicals. It was in the act of looking, and those who gazed too long often regretted it. Of all mysteries surrounding Helena Morrison, none is greater than her fate. After James's death and the photographs, she vanished. No body was found, no grave mark her resting place. Some believed she fled overseas, continuing her research under another name. Others claimed she was swallowed by her own obsession, perhaps even following James into death by her own hand. But rumors persisted that she had not died at all. In later decades, isolated sightings surfaced, a woman in black, pale and elegant, attending obscure lectures in Europe. A visitor to a Paris morgue swore he saw her taking notes. A family in Boston believed she knocked at their door one snowy evening, asking to see their infant child. Without evidence, her fate remained unsolved. But the absence of proof only deepened the dread, for if Helena still lived, what had she carried with her? And if she had died, had she truly gone alone? Over a century has passed since Helena Morrison's obsession, yet the photograph endures. Copies, though rare, still circulate among collectors, each carrying the same uneasy reputation. Museums display it only with warnings, while private owners keep it locked away, afraid to destroy it and equally afraid to let it go. For modern viewers, the image is more than a relic of Victorian mourning. It is a relic of human defiance. It represents the refusal to accept loss, the hunger to reverse the irreversible, and in that hunger it reveals something timeless, the thin line between love and obsession, between memory and possession. Helena Morrison's story is not just about death. It is about the human desire to command what cannot be commanded. Her legacy is not a child brought back to life, but a photograph that refuses to rest. Even now, those who look upon the boy too long whisper the same chilling thought. He does not look gone. He looks, waiting,